how my life will be governed in the moment of an emergency is so different than those who can run past me.
The people dying the most in heat waves are actually people in the nursing homes, and that's because they're utterly unprepared.
From a disability perspective, when there's natural disasters, we tend to be one of the groups that's left out of the evacuation processes. In some cases, we're left for dead.
Around climate change, the whole world is needing to shift. And so planning for emergencies really is about how we're going to help one another in those situations and who's going to be ready and how are we going to prioritize and how do we train for that. And so a climate adapted future means that there's an awareness and understanding of the increased risk to disabled people's lives. We need to have systems in place and people need to be ready to help us. And not as like a pity, but I'm equal to you and I deserve to live.
Disability is chronically unexpected. We are the world's largest minority, over 1 billion people, 22% of the working age population of Canada. We have to start to expect disability, to see disability as a natural part of the environmental landscape. And when we think of environment, it's not just the physical environment, it's the attitudinal environment too.
Starting to realize how climate issues and disability justice collide and how they interact. So are we thinking about the unique needs of people with disabilities? You know, not just someone who looks like me, someone who's in a wheelchair, but there's people with disabilities with all kinds of unique needs, and we want to make sure that we're including them in the climate adaptation, you know, working with people closely to make sure the solutions that we're coming up with are accessible, whether it's planning for flooding, which tends to happen a lot in Manitoba, or any other thing that can happen as a result of climate.
There's so much evidence that people with disabilities are disproportionately affected by climate change. It's quite clear, and you see it in mortality, and so just the data is there. And they're not considered in policies to adapt or respond to climate impacts. In the 2015 Paris Agreement, which is the international agreement that governs how we're going to fight climate change as a planet, there's a number of groups that are named as being more affected by climate change than others. People with disabilities, they're in this agreement that Canada has signed. Canada's climate adaptation policy and strategy, they don't have disability. So the government of Canada is not trying to design policies to enhance their resilience, but this is what governments should be doing. And you can't develop a climate adaptation strategy and not include people with disabilities.
Disabled people should be invited to the table. And if we're not invited, we need to demand to be there. And I think that's where we're at right now, which is not being invited and needing to demand to be there. As these rights become enshrined, we have to figure out, well, then how do we actually implement them and how do we put them into practice? The key question is, what needs will you have in this kind of scenario planning? But also, what needs aren't being met yet? Because one of the things around disability justice and climate justice is that things that non-disabled people are so terrified of, a lot of disabled people already live. Like income insecurity, unemployment, inadequate housing, poor health. These are the things that people are concerned with, and we're already living that. In particular, Black, Indigenous, and other people of color who also live with disabilities are further impacted because of the intersecting ways that they're marginalized by our social systems.
Disability justice, for me, is about recognizing the inherent value in all human beings. People have different ways of perceiving, different ways of thinking, whose brains work differently, whose bodies work differently. Each of us carries a thing of value that is needed by our society in order to enrich all of our lives.
Let's get the message out, let's free our people.
And that we each need the support and capacity to bring that gift to the world for our greater good.
I didn't ask to be born with a disability. This is how God chose my life.
Good evening, everybody, and thank you for...
I don't define myself as defective to start with. And I use disabled people to mean I'm socially discriminated because of my ability diversity, or I'm not fitting ability norms. Everyone expects certain abilities, whether it's body-related ones, like some people expect to walk, but then it's also the ability to have simply a good life, right? Which is the ableism.
Ableism is a set of beliefs that assumes that people with disabilities are somehow empirically inferior and evaluates a person's worth based on our ability to produce. Climate change and ableism share a similar worldview, that the Earth exists as a source of wealth. Any area of the Earth that isn't being exploited for its full monetary value is not serving the greater good in some way.
The term fossil-fueled ableism describes this connection between the expectations of what bodies are for and climate change that dates back to the Industrial Revolution. We call it the design apartheid. The Industrial Revolution happened. People's bodies became labor in a whole new way to produce profit. And if you couldn't do that in a certain way, we had to figure out what to do with you. And so we became institutionalized. And so cities built up without disabled people participating in them. And now, as we're dealing with climate change, we need to change that.
A lot of things that have been done to make the environment more environmentally friendly in general for the non-disabled population has been developed without meaningful consultation of disabled people in the first place. And it acts to exclude people with disabilities. So, say if you close a lot of streets to motor vehicle traffic, that stops me from using that street. The new bike lanes that have been put in downtown Winnipeg that have little ridges in it that make it impossible for me to cross the street now. Nobody can drop me off near where those bike lanes are because they can't use them either. So there is this environmental ableism that assumes that everybody uses their body in the same way, that assumes that everybody stands up, is two-legged, and has a limitless amount of energy.
In my conversations with people in the field of climate change, talking to them about the importance of disability inclusion, I've received pushback. So I'll give the example of, for a transition to a low carbon society, we need a mass transit that's accessible to people with disabilities. So making your system accessible in the long run reduces costs and actually makes it more accessible, not just to people who have mobility or visual impairments, but people with strollers, people carrying their bikes, older people. It really does make sense. And I've had pushback from climate experts who would say, well, that would cost too much. And it's fascinating that someone who's a climate activist is saying, basically, let's invest less in mass transit. So some people do have these ableist ideas that a mass transit system can be okay even if it's not accessible for 15 to 20% of your population.
For disabled people, our citizenship isn't fully realized. We're blocked from participation in society in so many ways. So with certain legislation that we have in place now, we're going to be working to reduce barriers. This is actually our chance to move away from that design apartheid and actually rebuild cities in ways that include more people, like to change transit ways, to change infrastructure in consideration of disability.
The way we structure our care systems, our social services, our other supports, it's important to look at all those systems as well. We've seen some of the things that are happening due to climate change, and we need to prepare for them. Not just thinking about what do we need to do to mitigate flooding or whatever, and we need to ensure that people with disabilities, they help co-create that better future, and that they're not just an afterthought in some of these processes.
Disability is administered by government and in society and is monitored in so many ways. It's shaped so much by policy. So when it comes to climate, it's one of those cross-cutting issues where it just requires lots of collaboration from different levels of government and is a very complex issue about how we live and who deserves what. And so how do we connect those dots? And how can our voices and our experiences be counted for when we design those new systems?
People need to be treated as equal. It's not 1900 anymore. People need to wake up, especially the government.
Whether it's, policy development or planning, or whether it's governments or NGOs doing that work, we need to look around the table, see who's there, see who's not, and if they're not there, why aren't they there, and how can we get them there?
For us to really hold states accountable in terms of respecting and protecting the rights of people with disabilities in the context of climate change, we were going to have to start insisting on our inclusion. We have a new Accessible Canada Act, and yet we still have a climate adaptation strategy that doesn't include people with disabilities. So there are some inconsistencies, and maybe sometimes those are so grave that they take the form of human rights violations, and in that case, litigation is the appropriate response.
Order in the court!
All over the world, there's lawsuits that have been launched against governments on human rights grounds, and there's some by young people, and there's some by old people, and there's some by Indigenous people. And now there is a case to recognize and include the rights of people with disabilities in responses to climate change.
People with disabilities, or people who come into disability, learn all kinds of innovation and adapt to living with disability. So the toolkit on adaptation is incredible from the disability community.
Disability adds depth and texture and creativity to a lot of situations, because we have to use creativity at a moment's notice. We have to get beyond the traditional ways of how the environment is used.
Disability teaches me to be adaptable, right? And so when the normal way of doing things doesn't work, I've gotten really good at finding the other way, the life hack.
Having a very limited set of options and figuring out what to do with it. You begin to view the world in a different way. It's a puzzle that you're constantly solving at so many intersections. Let's not miss out on all these, on this toolkit of ways of seeing that would be really interesting to apply in this situation.
Addressing ableism allows us to address climate change. It's the same philosophy that addresses both of these dangers for collective well-being. And that, we can do that. We can do that.
We got a lot of work to do.